to begin with his address, and then we'll move on to questions afterwards. Thank you, Julian.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for letting me come back to MacGill. It's a pleasure to be here. I understand that you did Brexit this morning, and this afternoon we're doing terrorism and cyber and serious organised crime. So decidedly, you're determined to cheer yourselves up today. I'm afraid I'm not, at least on the guts of what I'm going to say, going to lighten the mood, because over a period of 4 weeks, a month ago, there were 5 terrorist attacks across Europe, most of those not very far away from Ireland. And at the same time, during that same 4-week period, there were 2 major international and pan-European cyber attacks. So these subjects are, whether we like it or not, extremely current. As Lucinda reminded us, we're just over a year on from the horrid attack in Nice. In fact, I was in Nice on Friday. I was in Nice a year ago, the day after that attack, and saw how traumatic it was for the people of Nice. A year later, I was able to witness how far they have come in bouncing back from that attack, the incredible solidarity that they have shown as a community, and the care and attention that they have given, not just immediately afterwards, but throughout that year to the victims of that attack. But what struck me as I was listening to the names of the 86 people who lost their lives in that attack was the fact that they came from 19 different countries. So when the question is asked, do these challenges concern us? Not only the global challenges of cyber, but the physical challenges of terrorism. Yes, they very much do, because of the way these terrorist attacks can hit and can capture people, in that case, from 19 different nations. They do give rise to some incredibly positive human stories of courage and resilience. On Friday, the French president decorated a member of the Nice community, Frank, who on the night of the attack was driving along the promenade on his moped when he saw the lorry start hitting the crowd. He literally threw his wife off the back of his moped and raced after the lorry on his moped until he caught up with it, when he jumped off his moped, caught the side of the door, and started pummeling the driver. And he pummeled the driver, who was shooting at him by this stage, until he managed to basically knock him off the steering wheel, at which point he got shot by the police who had caught up with the truck. This guy, who I've now met, is, well, he's obviously a little bit fitter than me and most of, but he's a normal citizen who took into his own hands the responsibility of trying to help his fellow citizens of Nice. Again, on a positive note, Joanne Sainsbury from Wexford saved the life of one of the victims of the Westminster Bridge attack a few weeks ago, because it was thanks to her fast thinking and first aid training that she was able to give CPR to one of the people who'd been driven over by Khalid Massoud on that day. So there are some incredibly heartwarming and positive stories that emerge, but they emerge from, I'm afraid, quite a grim threat picture. Because if you just take the UK alone, another 5 terrorist plots have been foiled since March this year, and indeed 18 thwarted since 2013. That's one example of the tempo of the threat picture, terrorist threat picture that we face, which in some ways is unprecedented. But I do think, and in the spirit of setting the context that we've started, I do think it is worth just reflecting a little bit about what is the nature of this terrorist threat. Overall, across Europe last year, there were 142 failed, foiled, or successful terrorist attacks. And the figures have been drawn up by Europol, who once a year do a situation report. I mean, that's quite striking. But as we know, and indeed as we here know indeed, Europe has faced periods of more frequent terrorism. Between 1970 and 2015, more than 10,000 people were killed in more than 18,000 attacks. And the most deadly period for such attacks in Europe was the 70s and the 80s. And at the peak during that period, there were 10 attacks a week across Europe. What makes, therefore, the current terrorist threat feel so different? Well, it's global. It's linked to a transnational religious movement, which over a number of evolutions, from Afghan rebels fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, through Al-Qaeda and to Daesh today, has broadened the battlefield to the extent that it can rely, in effect, on a brand, on a franchise, and thousands of potential amateur wannabe terrorists. The puppet masters upload instructions to the internet to pick up a kitchen knife, get into a vehicle, and suddenly terrorism is within the reach of almost anybody with a grudge, a violent temperament, or in search of some kind of cause. And what's the outcome? While the absolute number of attacks is down, the lethality of terrorism has increased sharply in the last couple of years. I mean, I think it's remarkable, but between 1970 and 2014, there were no fatalities in more than half of terrorist attacks worldwide. But in 2015, the number of lethal attacks rose by 8%. It's been increasing since. The number of people being killed in each attack has also been increasing. Spectacular attacks, once practiced by Al-Qaeda, the Twin Towers, for example, have been replaced by, frankly, almost medieval atrocities of Daesh, beheading, burning to death, forcing children to carry out executions for the purpose of online propaganda. And this generation of jihadi terrorists seeks to destroy not just lives, but our values and our way of life. And the indiscriminate and unpredictable pattern of attacks is very much part of what they're seeking to achieve. The challenge for us, for our open, liberal democracies, is to successfully counter that threat without jeopardizing our own hard-won values and our own way of life, which is, after all, what it is we're trying to defend. So what are we trying to do? What are we doing about it? Well, as has been observed, these threats are, by definition, transnational. Member states agencies are, I agree, very much in the front line. But at the European level, we can and should do more to help and support member states in meeting and tackling these threats. And that's what we've been seeking to do, in particular over the last couple of years, through strengthening our external borders, not in the sense of closing them, but in getting a much better and clearer and timely information picture about who is coming in and out of our shared space, through strengthening the cooperation, in particular in sharing of information within our member states and between member states, through reinforcing the pan-European databases that have been built up over a number of years, dealing with these different security threats, and through establishing and spreading the highest possible standards and good practice in this field. We're making it harder for terrorists to travel, to train, to finance themselves, to acquire weapons and explosives, to go backwards and forwards to combat zones for the purposes of fighting, and the spreading of propaganda. Because beating the terrorists will inevitably take more than tightening our borders, improving our legal frameworks and databases. We're also going to have to attack the root causes that turns young people, often young people, down the route of violence, which means, as Lucinda has said and as she works upon, tackling radicalization. This is perhaps the hardest part of what we're doing on the terrorist side. Radicalization in our communities and online. We're tackling it together in our communities by bringing together those people who are in the front line, often civil society actors, people who are working with young people, working in the community, working in education, sometimes working with prisoners, ex-prisoners, to learn from each other, because there isn't one Brussels-wide model that can be applied across Europe. This is very much designed to fit the particular sets of circumstances. But you can learn from each other. You can learn what works and what works less well. And because, frankly, this is quite hard and lonely work, you can get some strength by seeing that others are grappling with the same kind of issues. We bring practitioners together from all across Europe in something called the Radicalization Awareness Network, which I'm very proud to have been able to try and reinforce a little bit over the last few months. But we're also working with the internet and communication service providers to try and tackle the problem of radicalization online, which is a huge problem. We need to identify some of this pernicious propaganda, to get it taken down, to stop it going back up, and to stop it spreading. There's a real need to do this quite fast, because the internet is forcing us to change some of our ways in which we work on security. To take one example, earlier this year, a young man called Damon Smith was convicted at the Old Bailey of trying to explode a rucksack bomb on the London Underground. He wasn't a terrorist, as it happens. I think he was an upset, slightly lost soul. But the point about his action was that he built a viable rucksack bomb that, had it gone off, would have caused mayhem on the tube for tuppence halfpenny. He built the device with shrapnel, a £2 clock from Tesco, after he'd Googled an Al-Qaeda manual on bomb making. This guy was a teenager. If he can do that, then others with a more evil intent can do something similar. Terrorist groups such as Daesh have devoted huge amounts of time and effort to churning out online material. Threats, hate speech, but also training manuals, advice on how to obtain and import weapons, instructions on how to make bombs, how to kill, elaborate footage showing the most brutal and most sickening torture and execution of their victims. So given that the internet is such a fertile terrain for radicalization, we need to step up our activity to combat it. I'm glad to say that we've got good cooperation from the social media and internet providers, both for detecting stuff and when it's signaled for taking it down. We've found tens of thousands of pieces of such material over the last 18 months. And when it's drawn to the attention of the internet service providers, in 8 or 9 cases out of 10, they take it down. The problem is twofold. First, of scale. That's tens of thousands of pieces. There are, in fact, hundreds of thousands of pieces, if not more, up there. And secondly, of pace. The studies show that this kind of horrible propaganda material is most viewed in the first hours after it's been posted. So identifying it and taking it down 24 or 48 hours later is good, but not good enough. So we want to work with the large-scale internet service providers to scale up this work and to make it much faster, which means getting them to invest in using automated technology to help spot it almost as soon as it's gone up or even before it's gone up. I'm glad to say that we're making some progress, but frankly, there's still more to do. 2 words on cyber, the other big challenge that has been referred to. Cyber threats have grown both strategically and endemically. Strategically because cyber is being used more and more, not just by criminals, although the criminals can use it at real scale and cause real damage, but also by other actors. And endemically because those threats are not, as it were, limited anymore just to computers. They spread from the virtual world into the real world in all sorts of ways that cause very real harm, as we saw during the recent attack when hospitals across the United Kingdom were basically being closed down. The criminal business model has fundamentally changed. We've been talking mostly about terrorists, but I want to just talk for a minute about criminal activity as well. Criminals think that this is fantastic. Some of the estimates of the rate of cybercrime suggest that it's growing faster than the rate of use of the internet. In other words, criminals think that this is almost a free good. When I was growing up, I don't know about you, bank robbery was about people in a car with stockings on their head and sawn-off shotguns. There's none of that anymore. Bank robbery has become a very unkinetic activity. As the FBI puts it, crooks are more often sitting at home in their pajamas, robbing banks online. Indeed, in Italy, physical bank robberies have gone down 90% last year. Doesn't mean the amount of money being taken out of Italian banks has gone down 90%. It's an obvious, ugly truth that while there is little or no chance of getting caught, cybercrime will remain an incredibly attractive business. And of course, it's not just criminals, as we've been reminded. There are other state and non-state actors who play in this space. 36 hours before the French presidential elections came to their conclusion, the political party and campaign nerve center of the eventual winner, President Macron, was hit by a massive and coordinated hacking attack. And it was absolutely clear the intention was to try and influence the outcome of the ballot. It failed because they had in place some very high-tech defenses. And indeed, one of the benefits of the new French president, I think, is his focus on this very issue, because he has lived it. We've seen the threat from state and non-state actors evolve over more than a decade, from the first sort of notable cyber attacks that we used as a form of punishment against Estonia in 2007 for, in fact, moving a statue, through cyber as a non-military means of achieving a military objective, 2010, the Stuxnet attack on the Iranian nuclear enrichment program, to one today where cyber can be used almost in a kind of Death Star-style demonstration of power, as happened last year in Ukraine when somebody closed down Ukraine's entire power grid. They may have failed in the case of France, but there's no way that these kind of attacks are going away. And as has already been recalled, we have other elections coming up, so we need to be ready. The Commission has decided to review the existing EU-wide cybersecurity strategy, which dates from 2013, so it needs a refresh, in order to put forward this autumn, in September, a set of proposals for discussion with the Member States to fundamentally review how we deal with this threat of cyber security, to look together at what more we need to do to strengthen our structures, the architecture of the internet, the security of our devices, our services, and platforms, the need to reinforce the defenses and the resilience of our critical infrastructure, like energy and transport, and to reinforce the cooperation between the public and the private sectors. After all, most of this stuff is owned by the private sector, and the private sector certainly have a lot of the expertise. But also to try and change behaviors. The trouble with cybersecurity is that everybody thinks it's somebody else's business. It can't always be somebody else's business. It has to be something that we take an interest in and we do something about. That means, as individuals, taking care of our own cybersecurity, but also businesses, organizations, the public sector. As I said, it was because hospitals hadn't been keeping up to date with cybersecurity that they were unfortunately too easy a target. But if we're going to ask people to change their behavior, we also have to think about how to help them. It's great that Microsoft made available a patch that meant that you couldn't be hit by the WannaCry attack after the attack. It was also good that it was available before the attack, but you had to pay £10,000 per computer to get it. Not surprisingly, hospitals hadn't paid that. So we need to have a discussion with, again, the large internet service providers about what they are willing to do to help us, to help ourselves to get serious about cybersecurity. And lastly, we need to have a look at our international cooperation in this field, because it is an international challenge. And that, for me, means not only thinking about how we work with people who, on the whole, think in a similar way to the way we do on these issues, like the United States, but it also means asking ourselves whether we want to engage with others, perhaps who don't think the same way as we do, the Chinese and the Russians, for example. China and Russia often say, the authorities, that they're as upset as anybody about the amount of activity, cyber activity, that takes place within their territories. Do we just leave it at that, or are we willing to try and take them at their word and see whether together we can do something to crack down on non-state actors who are active in their jurisdictions? I doubt I'd get out of the room if I didn't at least mention the elephant, so as I've almost run out of time, as a former ambassador here, and as Director General of the Northern Ireland office, I'm as conscious as any of you of the role played by the European Union in our peace process and its continuing importance. So while we might discuss a little bit further the implications of Brexit for security in general, one thing I am absolutely clear about, and I want to explicitly echo what Michel Barnier has said on this, including when he was in Dublin speaking to the Oireachtas, there is complete agreement all across Brussels that nothing in the Brexit negotiations should put the peace process in any way at risk. And I strongly agree with Michel Barnier when he sets that out so clearly. In terms of the wider negotiations, they're only just starting. You spent a few hours discussing that subject this morning. All I would say in relation to security is that I hope that the closest possible cooperation on security will continue to be possible in the future, because these are shared threats. We share a common analysis. At the moment, we share lots of cooperation in meeting them. And frankly, that's true today, it'll be true for the next 2 years, and it'll be true thereafter as well. So I hope we're going to be able to find a way of making sure that that cooperation isn't unduly disrupted. Thank you very much.